Wow, that's 2 minutes past, so we might get started. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And again, a particular shout out to our attendees in Melbourne. We hope that you're continuing to get through this really challenging time, and our thoughts are certainly with you down there. Before we get started today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. If this is your first PVI event, I am so pleased to have you join us. My name is Jessica Bean, and I have the honour of being chairperson for Patient Voice Initiative. I'm also a patient living with cystic fibrosis and diabetes, and as someone who has benefited from innovative treatment, I'm really thrilled that PVI is able to help patients and patient groups better understand the topics we are covering in this workshop series. 7 years ago, I was granted access to a genetic modulator therapy through a clinical trial. It would change my life in ways that mattered to me. It reduced my pain. It enabled me to take slow, deep, easy breaths. It reduced the painful procedures I had to endure. It increased my independence and allowed my husband to go back to work, something that was really significant for us, both emotionally and financially. But when the data was released for the study I was in, it didn't show any of these things. In fact, it showed a treatment for which the clinical indicators were really underwhelming. So how are decision makers to see the value of the medicine had for patients like me? We hope throughout this patient-based evidence workshop series, we can help patients and patient groups better understand the ways they can ensure that whole picture is better represented and seen by those who often determine access. Today's session is session 2 of 3, and will focus on patient-reported outcome measures, or PROMs, for research and for reimbursement. We still have one more webinar in this series, so please don't forget to sign up via our website. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for making these events possible and importantly free, because we know that cost shouldn't be a barrier to making this type of information broadly accessible. But we know that particularly for patients and patient groups, this is often the case. If you're an industry representative attending today and your company hasn't joined our list of sponsors, please get in touch and I would love to send you our sponsorship package. Before I hand over today's phenomenal speakers, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We will be allowing plenty of time for questions at the end. You can put your questions in the main chat throughout the session. But as this session was intended for patients and patient groups, these participants will be prioritised for questions. So we ask that if you're not one of these groups, could you please add your title or your organisation at the end of your question? And if we have time, we'll try and get to them. Or they'll help guide us to understand where the future content needs are. We also do have some pre-submitted questions that we'll try and get through. This session will be recorded, however, we won't be sending out the slide deck separately. And so now let's get on with the reason that you've all joined us today. Today we have 2 absolutely brilliant speakers joining us, and I am personally really excited to hear their presentations. We have Professor Rachel Morton and Simone Leyden of the NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia. Questions at the end will be chaired by Anne Single, who is part of the PVI team, but is also chair of the HTAI Patient Citizen Involvement Group. Professor Morton will be speaking about what is PROMs research and what can it do. Professor Morton is Director of Health Economics at the NHMRC Clinical Trials Centre and Professor in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney, where she leads a specialist team of economists and economic modellers. She has published more than 60 research articles and won more than $50 million in competitive research grants. Her research interests include the use of PROMs, patient-reported outcome measures, in clinical trial registry, in clinical quality registries for quality assurance and benchmarking, and PROMs in healthcare delivery. She enjoys working alongside consumers to develop research that is relevant and we are so pleased she has accepted our invitation to work alongside us today. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you to Anne for inviting me to join the Patient Voice Initiative. I'll just start my video. Hopefully you can see and also share my slides. Okay. How's that looking? Jessica or Ray, if you could just confirm that you can see the slides all right.
All good. Thank you, Rachel.
Great, thank you. So my disclosures also include that I'm a faculty member of the Melanoma Institute Australia, and I'm chair of a PROMs working group that is runs alongside the ANZ Data Registry, which is a two-country registry for all people with kidney failure receiving dialysis or who've had a kidney transplant. Okay, so it's important to define PROMs. Jessica spelled it out for us in her introduction, but specifically the difference between PROMs and PROs you often see as well. So a PRO is the patient reported outcome. It's a report that comes directly from patients about how they feel or how they function in relation to a particular health condition or in relation to the treatment of that health condition. And importantly, a PRO is not interpreted or changed by healthcare professionals or anyone else. So it's coming directly from patients. A PROM, therefore, is the actual measure, the survey or the questionnaire or the way you get that patient-reported outcome. And I'm going to talk mostly about PROMs. And it's interesting because there is some confusion about what a PROM is, or what is a PROM, what is not a PROM. And a recent audit we did among health professionals showed that when we asked them whether they use or collect PROMs among their patient populations, we had some surveys or questionnaires that were actually not PROMs. So on the screen here, I've got two examples. One is a very well-known and well-used quality of life questionnaire called the EQ5D5L. And you can see at the top, the question is phrased, under each heading, please tick the one box that best describes your health today. And the first domain is mobility, and you're asked to select the response that best describes your mobility. I have no problems in walking about, I have slight problems in walking about, I have moderate problems in walking about, etc. So it's asking you how you assess your own mobility. Another questionnaire that's sometimes thought to be a PROM is about performance status. And this is a very common scale used in Australia called the Karnofsky Performance Scale. And this asks clinicians, so usually doctors, nurses, allied health professionals, to assess what they think the capabilities of the person is in front of them. So the assessment criteria are things like normal, patient has no complaints, no evidence of disease, able to carry on normal activity, but some minor signs of disease, down to needs considerable assistance and frequent medical care required. And those are all scored. So the difference here is that the example on the left is a PROM because it comes directly from the patient, whereas the example on the right is not a PROM because it's a clinician assessment of the patient. So PROMs represent what is most important to patients, and critically, they provide information about what is not known through objective measures. As Jessica mentioned earlier on, one of the drugs that was giving her a lot of benefit was underwhelming, and this was probably related to its objective measurements. However, for her personally, in terms of her quality of life and well-being, there was a lot of value. And so PROMs is an important adjunct to objective measures such as blood test results or CT scan results that tell us how people are feeling. PROMs that are commonly found in MSAC and PBAC submissions include generic, global or quality of life questionnaires, and two I've got up here are used and have been used in the last few years in both MSAC and PBAC submissions to assess quality of life. The one on the left is a cut down version of the very widely used short form 36 questionnaire. This one's called the short form 12 health survey, and it has 6 domains of quality of life and 12 questions. The one on the right was a quality of life questionnaire that was developed in Australia, and it's called the AQUAL. This one is the AQUAL 8D because it has 8 domains of quality of life that it's looking at, and it stands for the assessment of quality of life. So those are 2 that are fairly common. Then there are other condition-specific scales or questionnaires that are also common across a lot of different diseases or disease groups. And one of those is the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale, or HADS. And again, you can see here, if you can read the wording in these questions, it's self-reported because somebody's being asked to select their responses to this statement. I feel tense or wound up. Most of the time, a lot of the time, from time to time, occasionally, or not at all. So it's a measure of how a person is feeling that comes directly from them. And because anxiety and depression can be involved with a lot of physical and mental health conditions, it's a commonly used patient-reported outcome measure. MSAC and PBAC also encourage disease-specific PROMs. So here, where there are very specific symptoms or components of the disease or its treatment that it's important to measure, disease-specific PROMs are used. And I've just picked up 3 here that are very common, widely used and validated instruments. One is for people with asthma, and it's called the AQLQ, the Asthma Quality of Life Questionnaire. It has 32 items, and it covers 4 areas in those items or those questions: symptoms, limitations in your activities, how you're feeling emotionally, and what the environment is like in terms of stimulating or producing breathing difficulties. The second example is cancer, and this is again one of the most widely used cancer quality of life questionnaires in clinical trials. It's called the QLQ-C30, which just stands for Quality of Life Questionnaire -Cancer, and it's got 30 questions or 30 items. And it covers the domains of quality of life, including physical quality of life, the role, how you function in your role in society, cognitive, so how you're thinking, emotional, how you're feeling, and socially, and then symptom domains specific to cancer treatment, being fatigue, pain, and nausea and vomiting, as well as having an overall global health and quality of life scale. So it's contains 9 domains in total. And then for people with visual disturbances or a treatment aimed to improve vision, the National Eye Institute Visual Function Questionnaire 25, and its acronym there, is one of the most widely used eye health PROMs. So these are often measured in a clinical trial, which forms the basis for the evidence basis for a PBAC or an MSAC submission. And often there's a disease-specific PROM, as well as a generic or multi-attribute quality of life questionnaire. And if anyone would like to have a look at more specific patient-reported outcome measures for different conditions, you can go to the link below from the Safety and Quality Commission. Okay, so are PROMs already used when agencies like PBAC or MSAC are assessing evidence in terms of what works? And the answer is yes, particularly for measurements of effectiveness, but also for measurements of cost effectiveness. And the way that those generic questionnaires are used, and in particular questionnaires like the EQ5D or the SF12 or the AQOL, is that they provide an index or a score at the end of them that is an index of quality of life on a 0 to 1 scale. So 0 is dead or the worst health state possible, and 1 is full and perfect health. So in health technology assessments, quality of life as well as length of life is considered to be a gold standard outcome. And many treatments and diseases have an impact on quality of life. So it's important to have not just whether the drug or the device improves the length of life, but also what's that quality of life. So the graph that I have presented here in front of you shows on the vertical axis the quality of life. So 0 at the bottom and 1 at the top. And on the horizontal axis is the length of life or time, the time that somebody is in that particular, we call a health state, or that with that quality of life. So if you look at this graph and you consider two individuals, one is individual A, is somebody who doesn't have the drug. And the other is individual B, who's somebody who does get prescribed this drug. And we want to know if it works. We want to know if it extends the survival time, makes people live longer, and we want to know if it improves quality of life. So what we can see at the top here is, if you can see my mouse, that both people start with a pretty high quality of life. It's almost perfect. So maybe about 0.95 or 95% of full health. And then after a little while, might be a year or two, this person has a big health event. They might have a stroke, let's say. And so their quality of life drops down to about 50%. They then go along with this level of quality of life again for another year or two. Then another event happens, it drops down, and they stay at about 40% of quality of life until they die. Whereas this person with the treatment starts at 95% of perfect health, continues in that a lot longer, has a smaller drop in quality of life, down to about 80%, but then continues at about 80% for some years before a final drop, and then to their end of life. And so what we see is that the brown shaded area is the additional quality adjusted survival. So it's the additional quality of life plus the survival time, the length of life that the treatment gives compared to not. And all of the PBAC and MSAC applications that have a quality adjusted life year or a QALY utilise this concept to measure whether the treatment is effective. So this PROMs data, because the PROMs provides the quality of life bit, are already contributing very much to our assessment of whether something works, whether it's effective. Okay, the next point I wanted to go through is the role of ensuring that the clinical trials used in MSAC and PBAC submissions include patient-relevant outcomes. And this is an example from one group. This is a group in kidney disease from the kidney community called SONG, which stands for Standardised Outcomes in Nephrology. And they have gone through a process of identifying and ranking the most important outcomes that should be included in trials, in this case, in trials of kidney dialysis. It's a 5-phase process, and just to step through it, it involves firstly a systematic review of all the outcomes that are used in these types of trials, then a ranking exercise with patients and caregivers to understand what is important to them. The next part are stakeholder interviews, again with patients, caregivers, doctors and nurses, researchers and policymakers, to then understand the values and the perspectives behind those important outcomes. The next step is then a very large survey with several rounds called a Delphi survey. And what that does is it takes the whole list of outcomes, the things, the factors that are thought to be important, and ranks them and re-ranks them and gets people to look at them again and again. And then the final phase is bringing together key representatives, patients, caregivers, other consumers with health professionals and researchers to review the final list, the short list if you like, and to endorse them and then discuss how those are going to be implemented. And I was lucky enough to participate in one of these consensus workshops, working through the whole process for people with kidney disease. And so this image here is one of the focus groups we had, and I was sitting at this table with a couple of people that you can see there, listening to, from a patient's perspective, how certain components of quality of life were more critical than others, and understanding and getting endorsement about what was most important. And it was interesting because as a researcher, what I've now done is added to my own trials the outcomes that came out of this process. So you might see some of the findings in terms of ranking what's most important to patients could be presented on a plot like this, which is a spiderweb plot. And the black, grey and blue lines represent each Delphi round. So you can see out of all the outcomes that should be included in hemodialysis trials, you have very patient important outcomes, such as the ability to travel or go away on small trips, tackling fatigue or energy, having a treatment that helps people not feel washed out after dialysis, ability to work, moving around, impact on family and friends. So there are a lot of critical outcomes here that can only be measured by PROMs. And with this information, we then ensure that those PROMs are included in our trials. So one of the things we're asked to consider is how can a community organisation contribute to this process? And I would encourage members of community organisations to join focus groups and panels to help identify and prioritise the patient important outcomes. And also maybe to be involved in helping us work out what is the minimum difference that we need to achieve to be able to say that something's better. So what's the minimum improvement in quality of life or in a particular symptom such as fatigue that makes a difference, to somebody's day. So in summary, PROMs can quantify the impact of a disease on a person's quality of life. They can quantify the impact of a test, a procedure or a treatment. So the treatment, the disease and the treatment, they are used to calculate an important outcome, which is quality adjusted survival. And the difference in the QALYs can determine whether a drug or a device is reimbursed, whether it's considered to be good value for money. And I strongly believe that clinical trials should be including patient-relevant outcomes, and the way to do this is to ensure that they include one or more patient-reported outcome measures. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a really brilliant presentation, and I loved the examples that you gave. That was really helpful, I think, and I can see the questions coming in the chat. Just a reminder, we will take the questions at the end. Next up, we have Simone Leyden. Simone is co-founder of the what was formerly the Unicorn Foundation in 2009 and is now NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia. After personally seeing a huge disparity in the treatment and support options for rare and less common cancers compared to more common cancers. In her role as CEO, Simone advocates for greater access to treatments and diagnostics, raises funds for neuroendocrine tumour nurse support service, funds clinical trials and research, develops education resources, and raises an awareness about NETs within the medical community and general public. Simone is an active member of many associations, including immediate past president and current research chair of the International NeuroEndocrine Cancer Alliance, and co-authored numerous publications and posters focusing on quality of life and patient-reported outcomes of NET patients. Thank you so much for joining us today, Simone.
Thank you, Jessica. I hope you can see my screen and you can also hear me.
Yes, all
fantastic.
Good to go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you, Anne, for the invitation to participate today. Obviously, this is definitely an area that is close to our heart here at NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia, and one that we're personally very invested in. So just a very, very quick overview of, as Jessica mentioned, who we are. We were formed in 2009, 2010 to assist and support patients and lobby, raise awareness about what was really a very little known disease, and to encourage and support Australian research. And I just want to touch on what are NETs, because we don't have all year to actually discuss what they are. But I guess to touch on the complexity of them really actually then feeds into how difficult it is and how it has been to really measure patient-reported outcomes, because they are so complex, they are very diverse, they cover off a very, very large area of the body, and as you can see from that image, if you can see it, they pretty much can appear throughout the body. We don't own an organ, and they can arise in any part of the endocrine system. And they're generally the rare subsets of what are more common cancers. What we are interested to see, and only we saw on the Cancer Australia website the other day, was that we know that neuroendocrine tumours are on the rise with diagnosis, but they're predicting about 4,900 new diagnoses this year. So that really puts us into that less common, but really it is quite the high end of that less common. And they're complex because they affect both men and women equally, and from young to the elderly. So since, there hasn't been too many incredible advancements, I guess, in treatments with neuroendocrine tumours. And I think because there wasn't such a collective push. And I only just wanted to show this slide because I think you can see there from around that 2010 to 2020 is where we've seen a really huge activity in the genomic modelling, the molecular examinations, but also you could see that there's very, very few new therapies. We only have about 2 blue ones out of them all, and I guess that is again probably testament to the disease. But what we are heartened to see is that there is a lot of interest in it, and I do feel that has been partially because of the rise of the NET patient advocacy groups. So since 2010, we have been instrumental in founding a patient organisation of the International NeuroEndocrine Cancer Alliance. And to date now, which is exciting, we have 26 patient organisations from 21 countries, and it's growing. We try to translate most of our materials into at least 9 or 10 different languages to try and keep it as a real global voice. But what the rise of the patient organisations has led to is huge patient engagement around the country. And this has also been in part due to the very, very strong relationships we have with our neuroendocrine cancer specialists, both here in Australia, but also internationally as well. So one of the first ever pieces of what we would call our first patient-reported outcomes was a global survey that we conducted in 2016. We had 2,000 participants and 2,000 patients from around the country. And it was the first of its kind to actually look at the patient-reported burden of a neuroendocrine tumour diagnosis. And what we obviously saw is, or not obviously, but what we did see was it didn't matter where you lived in the world or what healthcare system you had, there were very, very similar degrees of burden. And the considerable burdens around diagnosis and what that, the effect of that on psychological issues. And then obviously the huge burden around the late diagnosis and many of these patients presenting with metastatic disease. So the highlights out of that were obviously the burden of symptoms as well. The work and daily life, we were able to really drill down on how this affects patients and how many of these patients actually had to give up full-time work. Healthcare resource use, so many of these patients are presenting over and over and over again to healthcare professionals, to emergency departments, and that is because the lack of awareness or the lack of net specialists in this area. And it highlighted numerous unmet needs. So that was a very successful piece in that we then were able to get published in the Journal of Global Oncology in 2017, and we then also published in the Asia Pacific Journal of the Oceania data. So we were really drilling down on more specifically our region. And what is great about this is obviously that it brought a lot of awareness around this burden of the disease, but also the fact that these papers have been referred to on many, many occasions and by our net specialists at many, many global conferences. So from that, we then wanted to drill down onto those unmet needs and to try and find solutions to these patient-reported outcomes. And what could we actually do to influence and improve the quality of life for our patients? So we then went about a unmet needs in the international community of a survey. And what we actually looked at was the perspectives for patients, patient advocates, and then healthcare professionals. And we wanted to actually see if there were differences. And what also, even what Rachel was talking about before, is what are the priorities? Priorities for healthcare professionals are probably different to priorities for patients. And we had some really interesting results come out of that, especially around unmet needs in information. And we know that the information was difficult to get to, but I guess the disparity of what healthcare professionals believed that they actually delivered to patients, and then what the unmet needs were of patients who received that information. So from there, again, we were able to look at different solutions, and we're excited that we've been able to produce some fact sheets in 9 different languages, which we'll be launching very, very soon, to a global perspective, so that you can, no matter where you are in the world or no matter what specialist you have, you'll be able to, get the information that you need, and so will your healthcare professional. But the largest unmet needs that we identified were obviously information, access to diagnostics and treatment, and the disparity across the globe, the high care needs and the multidisciplinary approach to these cancers that are needed, and also research needs. So what are the priorities in research and how to involve patients actually in the research and the design. And again, this led to some fantastic publications in the International Journal of Cancer, and we won Best Poster at ESMO again, and also at the European Neuroendocrine Tumour meeting. And I guess I wanted to highlight that it's because both of those meetings are actually clinical meetings, but they obviously are very, very much aware of the importance of the patient the patient-reported outcomes is part of the whole clinical outcomes for patients. So that was they were quite they were big coups for us. So just very touching on some of the other work that we've done around patient-reported outcomes is financial toxicity, and also defining NETs and looking at the psychological and psychosocial issues of functioning and non-functioning. And from that work, we'll be looking at different solutions as well. But I guess the exciting thing that we are really interested in and wanted to present today is, and Rachel's touched on obviously what the definitions of PROMs are. We wanted to produce something that actually took in all three areas of this. So we really wanted to enhance the clinician-patient interaction, and we've been able to do that because our healthcare professionals are so engaged, which we are very grateful. We wanted to compare the effects of treatments and the different providers, more so, you know, what was the disparity between patients being treated within a centre of excellence, or what we would call a centre of excellence, and out in other maybe not so resourced oncology units as well. And also looking at how we can inform policy from these outcomes. So in 2000, gosh, it actually was probably 2015 when we actually started looking at how we could digitise our quality of life. And we first came up with the first version of our patient-reported outcome app that really just looked at quality of life. And that came through, again, one of our very engaged and patient-driven professors, Professor Rod Hicks, from PBAC, who really wanted to engage patients in informing their care. And as we all know, quality of life surveys are generally done on a piece of paper prior to your meeting with your clinician and your appointment. You've made to sort of think back on how you've been feeling and what you've been doing in between those appointments. And sometimes, sadly, those pieces of paper are filed away and potentially not looked at. And I guess that was an eye-opener for patients to realise that I'm filling in this information. I really want it actually to be acknowledged and looked at. So what we did is we then looked at how could we provide the gap or lessen the gap between the patient and then obviously how it informed the patient information and how that informed their clinical care. So in 2016, and 2017, thanks to the support of IPSN and working with the University of Melbourne, we have worked with our key clinicians across the country at those key sites to produce the first neuroendocrine tumour registry. So that is a clinical registry and a de-identified registry that collects all the patient data at those sites. And what we did was actually put together the patient app to actually as a connection into that registry. So what the patient app actually does is collects what Rachel was talking about, are these validated PROMs. And for us, our quality of life is as Rachel mentioned, the question, the 30, but we also have the GI net one as well. So the actual quality of life survey is 51 questions. So that's something in the future we would love to explore of how we can actually try and get that down. But we also use the validated tool of a Bristol stool scale, monthly vitals, and also the ECOG performance, because one of the key things that we wanted to do was try and recruit patients to clinical trials through this. So the importance of this recording patient data in real time was trying to enhance this clinician and patient interaction. So we know with our patients, some of them don't actually go to see their specialists between in anywhere up to 3 months, 6 months, and we weren't collecting any of that really important information around fatigue, or a lot of our patients are symptomatic, so they have extreme bowel issues, and we weren't really collecting that information between those appointments. So what we wanted to do was allow patients to actually record this data in the comfort of their own lives and in the comfort of their own homes. And more importantly, you know, we know that patients, when they go to their appointment, will be like, oh no, I'm fine, I've been okay. And the carer generally is like, you're kidding, you've been quite sick. We can now actually have those patients show how they've been feeling in between those key appointments if they're collecting the data, and they can show the clinician. They can show the clinician actually on their phone, or the clinician can actually go into the registry and identify that patient and see it for themselves. And we would like to think that, you know, we will get to a stage where the clinicians are looking at that quite closely and quite often. So the importance of using the registry, and I think, you know, we would love to have had the app as something that we would have been able to give access to all NET patients and not just those patients that are seen within those hospitals. However, we really did think that it wasn't going to have a huge influence on patient outcomes at any level if it wasn't actually connected into some sort of clinical data registry. So the registry, to be able to access the patient app, patients are given this de-identified, or so this unique code from their clinician. So it's a real partnership there, going back to the interaction. So what we can see is with the identifying patterns and health outcomes, this is actually collecting really important information, not just on a clinical trial basis, but throughout the whole treatment cycle. And again, we know that our patients are generally, they're not off any treatments pretty much for the whole duration of their disease. So we've been able to really look at, and we will look future on how treatments affect their quality of life in the real world setting and not just in the clinical trial setting, which is a really exciting thing. And when we start to look at how then can we influence this policy and informing policy, and also taking this into HTA, and showing real world evidence, not just in that clinical trial. So some of the things that we've been able to really look at is identifying the gaps in care. We really hope to recruit through this. We can identify patients that fit eligibility status, and then actually send them a notification through their phone. Currently, the two-way communication is the patients input the data, but healthcare professionals can actually send messages to them or send surveys if there was some specific other information that patients that they would like to get from patients. And I think, you know, in informing policy, you know, we really hope that the use of this information will help with what we're trying to achieve in getting a national NET framework or these optimal care pathways, because we want to see consistent care across the board for all our NET patients. So it's an interesting time, obviously, you know, here based in Melbourne, and seeing that one of our big centres at PBAC and the access issues that we have had for patients. I think all of us will agree that telehealth is something that we've wanted for quite some time, and it's been pushed into action a bit more. And I think even more so, this use of technology and allowing patients who are not going into clinic as much as they even previously did, so healthcare professionals are not seeing them in face-to-face meetings. The importance of collecting this data out in the community is even more vital. So we would love to see, you know, more personalised PROMs. You know, as I mentioned, our quality of life 51 question, you know, we would love to see that more broken down for us, specifically around what neuroendocrine tumour they have and where these symptoms lie within that. We would love to see how this real world evidence and using drugs out in the community or using treatments out in the community can influence submissions. And I think, you know, overall, we're very lucky in that our healthcare professionals absolutely see the value in patients and their input into their care. But I do think that we probably need to do more work on proving this value, and not being afraid of the patients really having influence in this area. So unfortunately for us, you know, COVID did sort of stop a little bit our progress with the rollout of the app, but not the registry. We are still rolling out the registry in those different hospital sites and collecting the data there. But what it has allowed us to do is to, again, use this current circumstances we have and look for other ways of actually trying to get patients recruited onto the app. And potentially that's through email consent rather than actually face-to-face. So there's still so much to do, but we are excited that, you know, there is the appetite for and the importance given to patients really putting their perspective into their care. So thank you, Jessica. I think that is my last slide. Yes, there you go. Hope I wasn't over time.
No, thank you. That was really fantastic, Simone. And oops, now it's me not sharing, just for a change. Hopefully that slide's going to go up. Really all it says is thank you, Simone, and thank you, Rachel, for those really fascinating presentations. I wonder, Rachel, if I can ask you to put your camera on again, or perhaps Ray's fixing that so that we can take some questions. I've got quite a lot here, so I'm just going to kick off with those. I might actually end this share because it's actually just interfering with the way I want to run my desktop. So hi everyone, I'm Anne Singles. So we've got your questions coming in through the chat box. So if you haven't written your question yet, please continue to do so. The first question I wanted to ask, and actually I think it's a question for both Rachel and Simone, was a comment that the forms are quite long for patients to fill out. And how does that work for different levels of health literacy?
Right, yeah, it's a good question, and it's often a question people ask and say, can't you have a short form? I think there's a couple of responses to that. One is that particularly an overall quality of life questionnaire, it has to make sure it does capture the things that are bothering people. And so there might be, for people with very complex or chronic diseases, there might be more than just a couple of things that are bothering them. So it is important to have a comprehensive and overall assessment of things in different domains, you know, social, role functioning, physical, emotional, mental health. But that can be achieved by a lot of cut down versions or modified or shortened versions of larger questionnaires. So something like the QOQ-C30, which has 30 items, is you know, a fairly lengthy questionnaire in terms of the number of items. It doesn't tend to take people too long to complete it, providing they can you know, read and comprehend the language that it's written in. So people often then choose shorter generic questionnaires like the EQ5D. It's got 5 questions only. And they're very simple questions to understand. There are a number of languages that many of the questionnaires are translated into. So again, something like the EQ5D is translated into more than 130 languages. So again, that for a generic quality of life questionnaire, that can be an attractive choice. But the issue, I think, with PROMs is that you may not be getting full representation from people who can't read, can't read English or don't understand the language that the researchers have written these questions in. And one example is we're using a quality of life questionnaire amongst Māori and Pacifica in Auckland. And there are questions, the way they're worded, it was an American designed questionnaire, and the way they word it just doesn't resonate with the things that are important to this patient population. So we're working with Māori to develop a more meaningful questionnaire that does capture the things that are important to people. So yeah, so I think that is you know, a very important point, but it's not always the length of the questionnaire, it's about whether the items there are important to those people.
Just before I jump across to ask that question to Simone, a follow-up question came in from Nick, which was, is the QLQ C30 suitable for use with children? And if so, what age? And that really made me wonder how PROMs work with children.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's an adult questionnaire. There are many cancer questionnaires for children, and the ones that I can think of, there's the PEDS Qual, or Pediatric Quality of Life, is a broad questionnaire, but it has a cancer module, and that has been validated and it's suitable for children, I think, as young as 5 or 6 years of age, right through adolescence and up to early adulthood. And so how do you measure, you know, quality of life? Is it self-reported? Do you have a proxy such as the parent, you know, mother or father or grandparent or guardian who completes it, and then is it actually a PROM? So researchers have grappled with all of these issues, and it's important that when assessing a child's quality of life that you're using an instrument that has been validated in that population. One of the ones that PBAC and MSAC recommend for children is called the Health Utilities Index 2, or the HUI-2, and that's designed to be used in children up primary school onwards.
Thanks. And Simone, when I was looking at your slides there, it looks like your instrument is actually quite visually appealing as well when you're administering this.
Absolutely. I think, you know, as I mentioned, and you know, our quality of life for neuroendocrine tumours is 51 questions. So going back to the usability, we have designed something that is, at least on a screen, very easy to use. Going back to the health literacy though, we are very mindful that using technology, we may not be able to get to a lot of more of our elderly patients, and we are going to look at those sorts of things in the future. But with the quality of life, it is, with the actual app, it is easy to fill out and easy to swipe right and fill out again. And it doesn't take very long, and it would take a lot less time on the app rather than in paper. And the good thing is, before you submit it, it does make you go back if you've missed any questions. And I think what's visually appealing, and as you mentioned, is that then goes into a graph. So patients can actually see all their answers and see it graphed. And I don't know, I'm quite a visual person. And you can see from my presentation, I love a bit of color and love an image. And I think that's really a nice way to try and simplify some things, and then able for patients, and this is key for us, to communicate those issues with their clinician, and having them graphed is really helpful. And the good thing about the app also is, even though it is 51 questions, you can actually hone down just to fatigue. I saw that, you know, fatigue is a huge issue for cancer patients, and especially ours. You can actually just click on the fatigue, and that will graph just your fatigue over the times that you've been doing yours. So if you want to just bring up a specific thing with your clinician in your very small, tight time that you have in your appointment, if it's just your diarrhea, if it's just your inability to, you know, get out of bed, you can actually just target those parts of that quality of life survey.
And Simone, another question for you, and I'm joining quite a lot of very positive feedback for both of you into these questions, but I'll share that afterwards. But people are wondering, how often in clinical trials, how often are these instruments, how often do people have to fill them out? Do they get a bit of fatigue answering these questions?
I think I'll leave the clinical trials to Rachel, but for us, we've been really mindful of collecting this data in real world, that we don't want to have patient fatigue. So in the slides, we have sort of identified how often, and patients can set their own alerts, but it would be really based on what treatment they're on, or also the stage of the disease. You know, we have grade 1 up to grade 3, you know, G1 patients only may see their clinician every 3 to 6 months. It's slow growing, it's just around scan. So we would encourage them to only do it once a month. Whereas patients that are really high grade and seeing their clinicians and on a lot of different treatments and sometimes experimental treatments, we would encourage them to be filling it out more often. But again, as you said, you know, we do have an alert system to remind people to do it, but we really are very mindful that we don't want to see that that information overload and that fatigue there. But I'll let Rachel talk about how it's implemented in clinical trial.
Thanks, Simone. The feedback we've had from patients is they're happy to fill them out as long as something's done with the information. So if it's relevant to how somebody's going, to ask them using these surveys once a month, then we find that patients are happy to fill them out, as long as then that becomes a conversation with their clinician, or it's used to guide clinical care, or that they know that each time they fill them out, it's going to be 1 point on the graph that Simone talked about, you know, the longitudinal graphs that show how quality of life or symptoms are changing over time. So in clinical trials, we always take a baseline measure, so before the new drug or the device starts, so we can see what people's quality of life is like before we introduce anything new. And then we want to ensure that quality of life and symptoms are measured at the time points when we would expect a change. So it might be a few days after surgery, and then perhaps 3 or 4 weeks after surgery, and then again at 6 months, where we would expect to see changes in the health status. So it's important that we measure when there is something happening, particularly because the end game is to try and work out whether the treatment is more effective, and we need to know, we don't want to miss those important times where there might be real fluctuations in quality of life or symptoms. And then the other point to that is longer term follow-up. So it's all very well if things improve over 6 months, but then if they go back to, you know, for instance, worse than when somebody started with a year or 2 later, then we want to know about that. So typically we'll have baseline measures, some regular measures throughout the treatment, and then at least something that represents more longer term measures.
Thanks, Rachel. I feel we're right on the hour, and I've got more questions here. I wonder if I might be cheeky enough to ask our presenters if I could follow up with some of those questions afterwards, because they were quite fascinating. I'd love to be able to share that. You can come back and say yes or no to me about that, because I know you're both incredibly busy people. So I do just want to finish on time and thank you for your presentations. I think the number of questions rolling in just shows how interested people are in this area, and actually that we need to do more communication in this area and have more discussions. Next week, we will be looking at qualitative research with Dr. Stephen Holden from Macquarie University and Dr. John Rule from the National Association of People with HIV in Australia. And I think that's going to be a fascinating session, and no doubt we'll get overwhelmed with questions again. But I really want to thank everyone for asking those questions, and I'll do my best to go through those and try and communicate some responses to everyone, because it's been a really nice active session. But thank you everyone again, and thank you most especially to Simone and Rachel for really fascinating presentations today, and we will have this recording with subtitles on YouTube very soon. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks so much.